Part 1. ICMESA Plant. Routine Testing Day. A summer morning, the 10th of July 1976. The light of Lombardy spreads thin like a blurred silken sheet. The air smells of damp earth, chestnut trees, and industrial dust. On the outskirts of Milan, the town of Seveso lies nestled beside the small stream of the same name, gentle, many red-tiled roofs and dark yellow walls. Within sight of the tower of the Church of San Pietro, one can see the gray concrete block of the ICMESA plant, 4 stories high, with an ivory-white chimney, above which is a small logo, Givaudan, Divisione Chimica. It is not noisy, just murmuring like a creature breathing through a lung of steel. Inside, large silver reactors stand in rows, insulated with old yellowed fiberglass. Acrid chemical fumes, mixed with phenol, hang in the air. The morning shift workers wear blue shirts, cloth masks, and rubber shoes. The sound of metal clashing, the sound of air pumps, the sound of a ballpoint pen scratching into a notebook. The air is familiar, like an industrial heartbeat. ICMESA is a facility that produces 2,4,5-trichlorophenol, an intermediate compound used in herbicides, detergents, and epoxy resin additives. This reaction, if controlled properly, is harmless. But if it overheats, it produces a byproduct that every engineer fears, TCDD 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorobenzo P-dioxin, thousands of times more toxic than cyanide, once present in the U.S. Agent Orange. So the cooling system must be running at all times, the temperature kept below 180 degrees Celsius. Today, the R101 reactor is scheduled for a routine test, meaning a short run, then shut down and cooled. Engineer Giorgio Frigerio, 28, is in charge of the shift. He sat in the second-floor control room, where there were pressure gauges, temperature plates, and shiny metal switches. An electric stirrer ran smoothly. In the corner of the table was a cup of coffee, wisps of smoke rising. He tapped his pen on the notebook. Temperature 158 degrees Celsius, stable. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. Dark green chestnut fields, morning sunlight shining on the tiled roofs of houses in the distance. A peaceful town, never in the news. Down in the basement, the R101 reactor contained a mixture of trichlorobenzene, ethylene glycol, and sodium hydroxide. The furnace stirred, steam gently spraying through the cooling pipes. The cold water circulation should have been on to keep the temperature from rising, but that day, for a short test, they had turned it off to save energy. A management habit. The alarms had been broken since the week before, waiting for parts from Zurich. No one thought it was serious. 10A. Giorgio called down to the factory. Is everything okay? Voice echoes. Okay. Reaction is steady. He nods, takes a drag on his cigarette, writes a few more lines. 11 o'clock. Temperature ticks up. 162 degrees Celsius, then 165 degrees Celsius. A technician glances quickly, sees the needle vibrate, thinks the sensor is off. No one intervenes. Inside the furnace, the reaction is exothermic. Steam and pressure are rising. At 170 degrees Celsius, the transformation is out of control. TCDD begins to form. A small amount, a few hundred grams, but enough to contaminate thousands of hectares of land. 11:30. Pressure hits 3.5 bars. Safety valve pops. A long hiss. No one is there to hear. A column of white vapor shoots out of the exhaust pipe, rises high, and dissipates into the Sunday. There is no condensation system. It is under maintenance. So all the chemical vapors go straight into the open air. No one in town knows that the mist contains the same poison that once deforested Indochina. 12 o'clock, the temperature drops. The valve closes. Giorgio signs the book. The reaction ends safely. He smiles, folds the pen. Outside, sparrows perch on the steel fence, their feathers quivering slightly. No one knows that tiny dioxin particles are clinging to their wings. Odorless, colorless, but they last longer than a person's life. Afternoon, the shift is over. Workers go home for lunch. Some go swimming in the small lake behind the chestnut forest. The south wind blows gently, carrying a thin white cloud over the town, spreading out towards Meta, Dizio. In the sky, it looks like a strip of summer clouds, floating, beautiful, silent. Part 2. The exhaust valve is stuck. Dioxin vapor escapes. Afternoon, the sun is shining. In Seveso, children play in the yard, kick soccer, ride bicycles. Adults hang blankets, harvest vegetables. No one pays attention to the distant chimneys still emitting smoke. The white cloud slowly drifts by, almost touching the roofs. By 3 p.m., chemical droplets heavier than water vapor began to fall. Fine dust settled on the roof, on the grass, on human skin. A mother carrying her child out onto the porch saw the sky turn gray, thinking it was raining. But there was no rain, only a faint, acrid smell, a smell of burning plastic and metal. She ran her hand through her hair, and her hand was covered with a fine, chalky layer. In the afternoon, the sunlight reflected off the dust, making the whole town sparkle as if covered in mist. On the fence, the spider webs gleamed silver. The child said, "It's so beautiful, Mom, like snow." At night, the wind stopped. Dioxin fell slowly, mixing with the topsoil. In the area between Seveso and Meta, where the wind changed direction, the amount of particles deposited was highest. They combined with organic matter, clinging to leaves, grass, fruit peels. No one noticed. People had dinner, listened to Italian music on the radio, talked about football. The next morning, July 11, a farmer named Luigi went to the rabbit hutch. All were dead, white eyes, hair falling out in patches. He thought there was a weasel. In the afternoon, 2 more chickens. On the third day, the tomato garden was wilted. The leaves burned black at the edges. He reported to the authorities. The secretary shrugged. Probably pests. But the phenomenon spread quickly. In Desio, dogs were seen falling. In Meta, grass was burning. Veterinarians were calling each other. One said, "There might be a chlorine leak." But there was no announcement from the plant. In the ICMESA conference room, engineers checked the books. The exhaust valve is working properly, no problem. Giorgio Frigerio was silent. He remembered when the valve opened. White vapor came out. He wrote a report. No danger. The director nodded. They sent a dispatch to Milan. No impact on the environment. On July 13, a technical team came to take soil samples. No one wore masks. They dug up the topsoil, put it in nylon bags labeled with numbers. One asked, "What if there is dioxin?" "We don't produce dioxin, only phenol," the team leader replied. They left. 3 days later, in the Zurich lab, the chromatograph gave a strange signal. A Swiss technician looked at the graph and was silent. He called out, "TCDD." The reaction was runaway, but the news did not leave the lab walls. On the 14th, the wind changed direction. Thin white clouds fell east of Seveso. A new layer of dust covered the yard, the roof. The child continued playing, drawing letters with his hands. Dust stuck to his nails, to his hair. A 5-year-old boy slept, and the next morning he had small pimples on his mouth and a red forehead. His mother thought it was a mosquito. 3 days later, the pimples swelled, oozed, and his skin turned yellow. The doctor said, "Allergy." No one knew they were seeing the first traces of dioxin on European skin. Part 3. White Clouds over Seveso. At noon on July 14, the sky over Lombardy was incredibly blue, but there was something strange about the light, a cold white, as if filtered through a frosted glass. In the fields south of Seveso, the newly cut grass shone silver, and the smell was acrid like burning plastic. In the distance, the Icmesa factory stood still, its chimney silent. No one in the town paid it any more attention. The smoke had stopped, life went on. Only a few farmers complained that chickens and rabbits had died of unknown causes, and that the mustard plants in the garden had turned dark brown. In the afternoon, at the home of the veterinarian Giovanni Riva in Dizio, the telephone rang constantly. One farmer called, "Rabbits are dying en masse." Another, "Cows are not eating. There is a strange smell in the pasture." Mister Riva went to check, found dead rabbits, cloudy eyes, hair falling out in patches, dark livers. He thought of chlorine poisoning or a pesticide leak. He wrote, "Report to the town hall." But the town hall secretary only said, "We don't want to cause panic." In Seveso, children still played in the Sunday. Everyone loved the white dust on the grass, drawing, throwing, sniffing. A 7-year-old girl, Lucia, picked grass to feed the rabbits. In the evening, the rabbits rolled over and died. The next morning, Lucia's skin was red, with pimples around her mouth. Mom applied cream, thinking it was an allergy. The next day, the pimples were hard as rocks, oozing yellow fluid. On July 15, the factory doctor was called to an emergency meeting. The engineers, pale-faced, put the Zurich report on the table. TCDD confirmed. The room was dead silent. The director whispered, "No one outside can know." They decided, no announcement, only medical supervision. Each signed a confidentiality form. A memory of Chernobyl 10 years early, repeated in Italian. On the 16th, the wind blew hard. The dioxin dust spread further. White clouds drifted over the village of Maida, covering the house pillars and chestnut trees with a silvery sheen. To the north, in Prada, sheep died on the hill. An old monk opened the door of the chapel and saw sparrows lying on the steps. "Oh God, what is this?" he whispered. No one answered. That night, Lombardy journalists heard about the chemical leak. But the Gavadan office sent a dispatch. No danger. A reporter sneaked up to the Igmeza fence and took a few photos. The next morning, the local newspaper only carried a small line. Minor incident at the Igmeza facility. No impact on public health. On the morning of the 17th, a thin white mist covered everything. A farmer walked through a chestnut field, stepping on the grass, making a small crack like stepping on ice. The leaves were brittle, breaking at the slightest touch. The tomato plants in the garden seemed to have been burned with acid, the skin cracked, the stems black. On the ground, the white dust turned yellow. A sweet, metallic smell permeated the air. Seveso was still, but under the sunlight everything seemed to be melting in silence. Part 4. Children and the First Red Spots. On July 18, the Dizio Hospital received its first patient, a 6-year-old girl with pimples around her mouth and a slight fever. The doctor wrote chicken pox. The next day, 3 more children from the same neighborhood. The pimples did not burst, but were hard and dark. An old doctor who had worked in Basel looked out the window and asked softly, "Is it Clarac?" No one answered. Chloracne, a disease characteristic of exposure to dioxin, had been seen only in American workers who made herbicides. Deep, painful pimples that would not heal for years. In Seveso, it was spreading like an infectious disease. At Lucia's house, she no longer went out. Her skin was burned around her mouth. Her mother took her to the doctor, who refused. We have no instructions. In the kitchen, her father listened to the radio. The official news still said, no danger. On the 20th, the veterinarian Riva fell ill. Her hands were blistered and burning. Her eyes hurt. He knew the cause and wrote to the Milan Regional Health Authority. Possibly dioxin contamination. Request soil and water testing. The letter went unanswered. At noon on July 21, a group of independent scientists came to take samples. They wore white shirts, boots, and dug into each layer of soil. In the air, white dust flew as thin as ash. People looked through the fence and asked, "What are you doing?" "Just checking." That evening, the interim results. Dioxin. The highest level was in Seveso, about 15 milligrams per kilogram of soil, an unbelievable number. But the health authorities remained silent. They were afraid that people would flee, afraid that the region's economy would collapse. On the 22nd, a secret meeting in Milan. Officials, experts, Roche engineers. One said, the central area must be evacuated. Another, no need, it will cause panic. The final decision, delay. Meanwhile, in Seveso, the grass burned, livestock died, children continued to develop pimples. Everything happened like in a white dream, no sound, no sirens, just the slow decay of order and trust. Part 5. Evacuation of Zone A. On the 26th of July, 1976, 16 days after the floodgates opened, a loudspeaker blared from the middle of Seveso Square. The population of the central area will be temporarily relocated for decontamination. The voice was even, emotionless. It seemed like a rehearsal. Army trucks were parked in rows. Soldiers wore rubber masks and white gloves. Children laughed, thinking they were watching a movie. Adults packed their luggage, a few sets of clothes, papers, dolls, and a cat left behind. A woman asked, "How long until we get home?" 3 days. No one knew it was a promise that could not be kept. Groups of people boarded buses. Outside the window, the town passed by. Iron fences, burnt orchards, roofs covered in white dust. A girl turned back to look at her house one last time. Windows open, curtains swaying, dishes still on the table. Behind, soldiers began spraying lime water, burying dead animals. The sound of shovels, the sound of doors being nailed, a dry sound. A car carrying dead rabbits swayed through the street. The smell of phenol and burning grease was as heavy as the smoke of a battlefield. At night, Zone A was quiet. The lights were off. Only the flashlights swept through the trees. The wind was light. The dust was still flying, mixed with the mist. A black cat crawled out of the garden and lay still in the middle of the asphalt. On the 28th, all 736 people in Zone A were evacuated. They were in temporary dormitories, student camps, and motels. Children missed home. Adults waited for news. The government declared, the situation is under control. But in the laboratory in Rome, the official results confirmed. TCDD exceeded the safety threshold by thousands of times. The press began to leak information. Corriere della Sera published, toxic clouds in Seveso, Roche is silent. Public opinion was in an uproar, but the factory remained closed. No one took responsibility. In the woods behind Icmesa, the soil had turned ash. Every time it rained, water flowed down the Lombarda stream. floating on a scum like oil. Fish died. The children in the remote areas thought it was fun, scooped it up with nets, touched it with their hands. A few days later, they also broke out in pimples. Part 6. Identification of the toxin, TCDD, August 1976. After 3 weeks of crisis, the Italian Institute of Chemistry published a 40-page report. The waste in the Seveso area contains 2, 3, 7, 8 tetrachlorobenzo p-dioxin. Toxicity: 10 micrograms is enough to cause endocrine disruption. 30 micrograms can kill an adult. In the soil of Area A, the measured level, 15,000 micrograms per kilogram. The press called it the poison of war dropped in the heart of Europe. Those who had worked in Mesa panicked. Some left. A few were quarantined. Giorgio Frigerio was called in for questioning. His eyes sunken, he whispered, "I was just following the procedure." The Italian government set up a scientific emergency committee. They marked off Zone A red, B yellow, R green. The entire Zone A was locked down. B was under health surveillance. Doctors measured blood, checked liver enzymes, thyroid, hormones. Dozens of pregnant women were advised to have abortions because of the risk of malformations. They cried, signed papers. The press called them the unborn Seveso children. The Swiss government, where Roche is headquartered, sent an investigation team. A Zurich engineer said, "If the valve had not opened, the whole plant could have exploded." A scientist replied, "But you opened it without a filter." They were silent. In Rome, the parliament debated all night, should there be criminal prosecution? But environmental laws at that time were not enough. Only a few factory managers were fined. People called it the punishment of silence. In September, the decontamination campaign began. Thousands of animals were destroyed. The soil was raked, buried under lime. Engineers in rubber suits dug for half a meter. Phenol and chlorine fumes made people faint. An engineer fell down and was pulled out, his face pale, his nose bleeding. Every inch of earth seemed to hide something that wanted to rise. In the makeshift camp, children were bathed in disinfectant. Their blood was measured and their records were kept. A little girl asked, "When will I go home?" No one answered. Her house had been buried. Part 7. Soil treatment and concrete walls. In the fall of 1976, the sky in Lombardy was milky. The wind blew down from the Alps, swirling white dust into small whirlpools on the deserted road. Area A became an open wound. No more human voices, only the steady roar of excavators, scraping layers of earth onto tarpaulin-covered trucks. Soldiers in white protective suits and breathing masks moved slowly like ghosts among the lifeless land. Each shovel stroke was accompanied by the smell of phenol, chlorine fumes, and the strange feeling that the earth itself was hurting. The engineers built a 2-meter-high fence, surrounded by red warning signs, Zona Contaminata, non intrare. At night, halogen lights shone down. The white dust glittered like artificial snow, but everyone knew it was toxic ash. Behind the fence, the trees were bare. Everything became a single color palette: white, gray, and sickly yellow. The decontamination operation was called Bonifica Seveso, one of the largest civil missions in Europe after World War II. It was decided to dig up the entire topsoil of 1.8 square kilometers. Thousands of cubic meters of soil were scooped up, sealed, and put into steel containers. The problem was where to bury it. No one wanted to receive such a gift. Switzerland refused. Germany refused. Finally, the soil was transported to a sealed vault in the Basel area. placed in black-painted containers, labeled residui toxici. But before it was taken away, it had to be temporarily detained in Seveso. On the edge of town, a huge containment area was built. Concrete tanks tens of meters deep, 40 centimeters thick, covered with steel lids. Some journalists called it the cemetery of the earth. Every afternoon, the sound of concrete mixers rumbled. The cement water overflowed, congealing like scar scales. On October 12, the engineering team completed the first part of the enclosure wall. Inside, all the carcasses of animals, plants, clothes, and contaminated objects were dumped. A young soldier stood watching the smoke rise, asking, "Are we burying their souls?" No one answered. Meanwhile, scientists worked tirelessly to understand the mechanism of TCDD. At the Milan Institute, white mice were injected with extremely small doses. Within a few days, their livers shrank, their skin changed color, and their hair fell out. Scientists took notes, their faces expressionless. One said, "Just a billionth of a gram per kilogram is enough to change the endocrine system." Dioxin does not kill quickly. It changes, silently, persistently. In the temporary area, the people of Seveso live with blank memories. Every day they hear the loudspeaker, "Do not return to the old area." Photos of their hometown hang on the walls of their dorm rooms. Children draw houses, but add fences and people in protective gear. One girl writes, "My house is buried under cement." By winter, the cleanup is complete. Zone A is leveled, covered with new soil. The weeds wither. On the administrative map, the area is crossed out. No people, no roads, no names. But underground, dioxin remains, with a decay cycle of nearly 100 years. In 1977, the government decided build a park on the contaminated area to restore confidence and landscape. The idea sounds nice, but to build the park, they had to add a layer of clean soil 1.5 meters thick, then plant grass, trees, and an artificial lake. People call it Bosco della Querce, oak forest. What was once the epicenter of the chemical industry is now a quiet park. But those who know say that at the foot of the forest, there is still a layer of soil that has seen everything die. Part 8. Legacy. The Seveso Law and European Memory. 10 years later, 1986. In Brussels, the European Parliament passed Directive 82 divided by 500 and 1 divided by EEC, also known as the Seveso Law. For the first time in history, Europe set strict rules for chemical plants, risk assessments, public reporting, and emergency response plans. An explosion in Italy changed the way the continent viewed industry. In Seveso, the Bosco della Querce Park gradually turned green again. Grass grew evenly, oak trees grew tall, and the small lake reflected the sky. On the water, there was sometimes a metallic sheen, a thin layer of oil left. Every time it rains, the smell of earth rises, mixed with the faint smell of rust and phenol, recognizable only to those who have lived here. Newer generations of children come to play, not knowing anything about the white days. But the old people still remember. Every time they pass through the gate, they stop and put their hands on the cold concrete wall. An old woman whispers, "Down here, my house is still there." Epidemiological studies have lasted for decades. They found higher rates of liver cancer, endocrine disorders, and birth defects in the area around Seveso. Dioxin does not disappear. It passes through the food chain, through the blood, through generations. One scientist wrote, "Seveso is not an instant disaster, but a genetic scar." In the 1,990 seconds, When the Soviet Union collapsed and the world looked back on industrial disasters, the name Seveso became symbolic, not because of its scale, but because of its silence. There was no explosion, no fire, just a white dust falling like snow, carrying with it the most toxic substance ever created by man. The press described it as Chernobyl without smoke. The same denial, the same chain of bureaucracy, the same tragedy of progress without control. In 2001, the Seveso II directive was issued, extended to the entire EU. Every large plant had to have a risk map. A young engineer reading the document in Warsaw saw a small line at the top, named after the accident in Seveso, Italy, 1976. He looked it up online and saw old photos. A child with a red spot on his face, a soldier spraying lime water, a white field, all as silent as a gray photograph. In 2010, at the 34th anniversary commemoration, survivors gathered by the lake. The wind was gentle, oak leaves were falling, the water was still. A middle-aged man, who had been Lucia back then, read the tribute. There was no siren, no bullets, just a white cloud. It taught us that the scariest thing is not death, but when people know and remain silent. In Zurich, a retired Givaudan employee wrote in his memoirs, "We thought it was just a small reaction, but every reaction has a memory, and that memory is in the soil." In 2016, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary, the European Environment Agency erected a stone tablet in the middle of the Bosco della Querce Park. The tablet was not large, but was engraved with a few lines in three languages. 10 luglio 1976, Seveso non dimentica. 10 July 1976, Seveso does not forget. There were no speeches at the ceremony, only the sound of the wind blowing through the oak trees. A boy stopped his bicycle and asked his mother, "Mommy, what's here?" She looked down at the ground and said, "Yes, a lesson." As the sun set, the light filtered through the dense oak trees, casting a deep golden streak. Underground, thick layers of concrete still lay there, silent. Time had covered them with grass, moss, and oblivion, but it could not erase what had eaten into the skin of the soil, the blood of people, and the memories of an entire continent. 40 years later, whenever Seveso was mentioned, people did not talk about chemicals, but about responsibility, a word as invisible, as difficult to wash away, and as long-lasting as dioxin.